Permanent Record by Edward Snowden, Session 5 Hacking. All teenagers are hackers. They have to be, if only because their life circumstances are untenable. They think they are adults, but the adults think they are kids. Remember, if you can, your own teen years, you were a hacker too, willing to do anything to evade paternal supervision. Basically, you were fed up with being treated like a child. Recall how it felt when anyone older and bigger than you sought to control you, as if age and size were identical with authority. At one time or another, your parents, teachers, coaches, scoutmasters, and clergy would all take advantage of their position to invade your private life, impose their expectations on your future, and enforce your conformity to past standards. Whenever these adults substituted their hopes, dreams, and desires for your own, they were doing so, by their account, for your own good, or with your best interest at heart. And while sometimes this was true, we all remember those other times when it wasn't, when because I said so wasn't enough, and you will thank me one day rang hollow. If you have ever been an adolescent, you have surely been on the receiving end of one of these cliches, and so on the losing ends of an imbalance of power. To grow up is to realize the extent to which your existence has been governed by systems of rules, vague guidelines, and increasingly unstoppable norms that have been imposed on you without your consent and are subject to change at a moment's notice. There were even some rules that you would only find out about after you would have violated them. If you were anything like me, you were scandalized. If you were anything like me, you were nearsighted, scrawny, and age wise barely entering the double digits when you first started to wonder about politics. In school, you were told that in the system of American politics, citizens give consent through the franchisee to be governed by their equals. This is democracy. But democracy certainly wasn't in place in my US history class, where, if my classmates and I had the vote, Mr. Martin would have been out of a job. Instead, Mr. Martin made the rules for US history. Miss Evans made the rules for English. Mr. Sweeney made the rules for science. Mr. Stockholm made the rules for math. And all of those teachers constantly changed those rules to benefit themselves and maximize their power. If a teacher didn't want you to go to the bathroom, you had better hold it in. If a teacher promised a field trip to the Smithsonian Institution but then cancelled it for an imaginary infraction, they would offer no explanation beyond citing their broad authority and the maintenance of proper order. Even back then, I realized that any opposition to this system would be difficult, not least because getting its rules changed to serve the interest of the majority would involve persuading the rule makers to put themselves at purposeful disadvantage. That ultimately is the critical flaw or design defect internationally, integrated into every system. In both politics and computing, the people who create the rules have no incentive to act against themselves. What convinced me that school, at least, was an illegitimate system was that it wouldn't recognize any legitimate dissent. I could plead my case until I lost my voice, or I could just accept the fact that I had never had a voice to begin with. However, the benevolent tyranny of school, like all tyrannies, has a limited shelf life. At a certain point, the denial of agency becomes a license to resist, though it's characteristic of adolescence to confuse resistance with escapism or even violence. The most common outlets for a rebellious teen were useless to me because I was too cool for vandalism and not cool enough for drugs. To this day, I have never even gotten drunk on liquor or smoked a cigarette. Instead, I started hacking, which remains the sanest, healthiest, and most educational way I know for kids to assert autonomy and address adults on equal terms. Like most of my classmates, I didn't like the rules but was afraid of breaking them. I knew how the system worked. You corrected a teacher's mistake, you got a warning. You confronted the teacher when they didn't admit the mistake. You got detention, someone cheated of your exam. And though you didn't expressly let them cheat, you got detention and the cheater got suspended. This is the origin of all hacking, the awareness of a systematic linkage between input and output, between cause and effect. Because hacking is not just native to computing, it exists whenever rules do. To hack a system requires getting to know its rules better than the people who created it or are running it, and exploiting all the vulnerable distance between how those people had intended the system to work and how it actually works or could be made to work. In capitalizing on these unintentional uses, hackers are not breaking the rules as much as debunking them. Humans are hardwired to recognize patterns. All the choices we make are informed by a cache of assumptions, both empirical and logical, unconsciously derived and consciously developed. We use these assumptions to assess the potential consequences of each choice, and we describe the ability to do all of this quickly and accurately as intelligence. But even the smartest among us rely on assumptions that we have never put to the test. And because we do, the choices we make are often flawed. Anyone who knows better or thinks more quickly and more accurately than we do can take advantage of those flaws to create consequences that were never expected. It's this egalitarian nature of hacking, which doesn't care who you are, just how you reason, that makes it such a reliable method of dealing with the type of authority figures so convinced of their system's righteousness that it never occurred to them to test it. I didn't learn any of this at school. Of course, I learned it online. The internet gave me the chance to pursue all the topics I was interested in and all the links between them, unconstrained by the pace of my classmates and my teachers. The more time I spent online, however, the more my schoolwork felt extracurricular. The summer I turned 13, I resolved never to return, or at least to seriously reduce my classroom commitments. I wasn't quite sure how I had swung that though. All the plans I came up with were likely to backfire. If I was caught skipping class, my parents would revoke my computer privileges. If I decided to drop out, they would bury my body deep in the woods and tell the neighbors I had run away. I had to come up with a hack, and then on the first day of the new school year, I found one. Indeed, it was basically handed to me. At the start of each class, the teachers passed out their syllabus, detailing the material to be covered, the required reading, and the schedule of tests and quizzes and assignments. Along with these, they gave us their grading policies. which were essentially explanation of how A's, B's, C's and D's were calculated. I had never encountered information like this. Their numbers and letters were like a strange equation that suggested a solution to my problem. After school that day, I sat down with the syllabus and did the math to figure out which aspects of each class I could simply ignore and still expect to receive a passing grade. Take my US history class, for example. According to the syllabus, quizzes were worth 25%, tests were worth 35%, term papers worth 15%, homework was worth 15%, and class participation, that most subjective of categories in every subject, was worth 10%. Because I usually did well on my quizzes and tests without having to do much with studying, I could count on them for a reliable pool of time efficient points. Term papers and homework, however, were the major time sucks. Low volume, high cost impositions on me time. What all of those numbers told me was that if I didn't do any homework but aced everything else, I would wind up with a cumulative grade of 85. A B. If I didn't do any homework or write any term papers but aced everything else, I would wind up with a cumulative grade of 70. A C minus. The 10% that was class participation would be my buffer. Even if the teacher gave me a 0 in that, if they interpreted my participation as disruption, I could still manage a 65, a D minus. I would still pass. My teachers' systems were terminally flawed. Their instructions for how to achieve the highest grade could be used as instructions for how to achieve the highest freedom. A key to how to avoid doing what I didn't like to do and still slide by. The moment I figured that out, I stopped doing homework completely. Every day was bliss, the kind of bliss forbidden to anybody old enough to work and pay taxes. Until Mr. Stockton asked me in front of the entire class why I hadn't handed in the past half dozen or so homework assignments. Untouched as I was by the guilt of age and forgetting for a moment that by giving away my hack, I was depriving myself of an advantage. I cheerfully offered my equation to the math teacher. My classmates' laughter lasted just a moment before they set about scribbling, calculating whether they too could afford to adopt a post homework life. Pretty clever, Eddie, Mr. Stockton said, moving on to the next lesson with a smile. I was the smartest kid in school until about 24 hours later when Mr. Stockton passed out the new syllabus. This stated that any student who failed to turn in more than 6 homeworks by the end of the semester would get an automatic F. Pretty clever, Mr. Stockton. Then he took me aside after class and said, "You should be using that brain of yours not to figure out how to avoid work, but how to do the best work you can. You have so much potential. Ed, but I don't think you realize that grades you get here will follow you for the rest of your life. You have to start thinking about your permanent record."